Hello, I'm Michael Spitzer. I'm so thrilled to be here in Krakow at the Unsound Festival, and I'm here to talk about the evolution of music based around my recent book. And let's start with a thought experiment. So in 1977, NASA sent a probe, Voyager 1, to outer space, and it contained the Golden Record, which is a kind of earthly playlist containing 27 sample tracks of the world's music. In some ways, it's a sonic bubble of our musical civilizations. And amongst these 27 tracks, you had gamelan music from Indonesia, panpipe music from the Solomon Islands, the Bach Brandenburg concertos, and Johnny Be Good by Chuck Berry. It's said that NASA intercepted a message from the aliens a few years later, which simply said, "Send more Chuck Berry." We'll never know, most likely, if and when the tracks are ever received. But however, it's an interesting thought experiment to view the entirety, the totality of music, Earth music, from an alien perspective, to knock together heads, to knock together our provincial viewpoints. And what I want to do is think, what is human about human music? And secondly, where does our music come from? So in the time we have today, I'll try to very quickly rush through many millions of years of human music. Now, the problem with any deep history of music is that, unlike the history of literature or the graphic arts, there are no records, pun intended. There are no records prior to Edison and his phonograph in 1877. So we have to do a lot of extrapolation, a lot of inferential mapping. But we do have relics, and these bone flutes were recovered from the South German caves, the Höhle Fels cave, and they're about 40,000 years ago. So we do know with utmost certainty that there were musical instruments about 40,000 years ago, and we can tell a lot about that. We can argue that what we call behavioral modernity coincided with this discovery, and by that we mean when Homo sapiens essentially became modern. So modernity starts a lot earlier than we think it does. And by modernity, we mean a cognitive revolution, the crystallization of symbolic language. Next to the flute was discovered a figurine of a woman, which is the world's earliest example of representational art. So it was possible to represent the human form at the same time as people were carving musical instruments. So we have the first music technology, and this is incredibly significant because similar kinds of flutes were discovered across a 15,000-year period, which is far, far longer than the time which separates us from Monteverdi or Bach or Gregorian chant. So across 15,000 years, there was a standardization of flute manufacture, a standardization of where you put the holes, where you carve the holes, and from that we have standardization of pitches and scales and melodic structures. Now, the question is, why Europe? It's every Germanic musicologist's dream that music began in Germany, frankly. But it actually is quite circumstantial because in South Africa, there's a Blombus cave, which contains far, far earlier evidence of cave art, albeit less representational. So we can certainly deduce that Homo sapiens achieved modernity long before the diffusion into Europe. They were behaviorally mature in Africa, but that still begs the question, why are there no bone flutes in Africa? And it comes down to the fact that there weren't the right kind of bones. The flute was made from bird bones, the bones of a vulture, which are hollow and therefore very light. And if you do a survey of all the bird fossils ever recovered in the world, there's hardly any in Africa. You can see swans and vultures and geese and eagles, and they all come from Europe or the Middle East and not in Africa. So that means that although African sapiens had the ability to make musical instruments, they lacked the opportunity to make them. So let's put the flutes in the middle of our timeline, and I'll go backwards far, far earlier than 40,000 years ago to ultimately the dinosaurs and the animal kingdom. And then flipping to go forward, not just to Western music, but the other pathways, the other musical civilizations. As I say, all in about half an hour, so there'll be a few shortcuts. And I'll take it in 3 slices, beginning with animals, and then hominins, the ancestors of Homo sapiens, and thirdly, looking at global history. Animal music. Okay, we're not dealing with music, but with musicality, with the musical faculties, and these include rhythm and entrainment, the ability to listen to a regular beat and to tap in time with it. This is called entrainment. We can all do it, and many animals can also do that. And the second faculty is melody and vocal learning, the ability to imitate and to create a melody. And we can more or less all do that as well. And the third faculty is tradition and history, the ability to share music socially and to hand it down to one's children. So rhythm comes first. Little crickets can come together in choruses called lecking, and they pulse together, creating a beacon effect for extra loudness. And they do this to attract female crickets as part of what Charles Darwin calls sexual selection. And they pulse in perfect time, in perfect synchrony. And they were doing this many, many millions of years ago in the Jurassic period. And the earliest fossil of a katydid, or bush cricket, was dated 165 million years ago. And scientists in Japan reconstructed the pitch that they were stridulating. Stridulation is when they're rubbing one leg against the other to create that chirp. And they can reconstruct that that pitch was an E natural, a very high E natural. The first note ever heard was an E natural, and it was heard by other dinosaurs. And the second faculty of melody and vocal learning, this is a nightingale. Nightingales have a repertoire of at least 200 songs, and the more songs they know, the more they attract the female nightingale. And the earliest syrinx, which is the bird's vocal organ, analogous to the human larynx, was dated 66 million years ago in the Cretaceous period. So again, we know that melody was going on a long, long time before human melody. And using a spectrogram, we can analyze the acoustics of the song to show just how organized the music is. It sings in patterns, in recursive levels, pattern upon pattern. And if you zoom in, you can explode the first pattern and look at the sub-motives within the motives, building up a hierarchy, very analogous to human language. So a Chomskyan transformational tree diagram of a simple sentence indicates that human language is also hierarchical, but that begs the question, is what the bird doing a language, or is it a music, or is it possibly both? Because certainly you can also map the structure of a Bach chorale with a Chomskyan tree diagram showing level upon level of musical structure or musical hierarchy. And as for a culture, well, humpback whales also sing in hierarchical languages, and they've been around for at least 30 million years. And you can parse a humpback song into units and phrases and themes, and a session which will last 23 hours, for instance. And they have a culture because in any population of humpback whales, a population, say, in Hawaii or the Caribbean or in Australia, every male member of the population sings the same song. Not at the same time, but they share the same repertoire. And this repertoire slowly evolves over a 5-year period, after which it starts again. So whales have a culture. So the fact that birds and whales and cetaceans and humans and also bats have musicality does not mean we evolved from any of them. Rather, it bespeaks convergent evolution, that these 4 species independently discovered musicality. In particular, vocal learning, this ability to learn new songs and through imitation, which is perhaps the key musical faculty that human beings have perfected. And it's interesting because, as far as I know, this is the first attempt to contextualize human music in a deep history. This is by Roger Payne, the whale scientist, and this little evolutionary chart starts off with crickets and then rises through birds and then whales, culminating with humans in ever more complex vocal learning. Now, what's, of course, interesting there is what's missing, and what's missing is the apes, because humans evolved along the ape line. The question is, why the silence of the apes? And this is very strange because apes are profoundly unmusical. They have no vocal learning and they have no entrainment. They can't beat time. So it's a bit of a cosmic joke that humans evolved from apes, or human music evolved along the ape line. How do we account for that? Well, although apes have no rhythm and they have no melody, what they do have is an incredibly rich repertoire of gesture and an ability to be very creative in how they make gesture. And what gestures do? They demonstrate intentionality or intention, and also attention, and attention to attention. And I would argue that this becomes a basis for what is social about human music. My argument is that human music is intrinsically sociable. We make music with other people, and it is participatory. It is active. Let's now turn to the second slice, which is hominins, the ancestors of Homo sapiens. There are many intervening stages here, but this is an outline. Australopithecines, about 4 million years ago, is the first hominin to stand up on its hind legs and walk. Homo erectus, 2 million years ago. Neanderthals, about 300,000 years ago. And where we are now, Homo sapiens achieved its anatomical modernity about 200,000 years ago. And there's a lot we can extrapolate from, respectively, the anatomy and the tools that hominins made. So a lot falls out from the fact that 4.4 million years ago, the Australopithecine starts to walk. It's all about walking, or what we call bipedalism. What we have is the two-step regularity of rhythm, left, right, left, right. And the pattern predictability, it teaches our brain to predict what will happen next in a temporal sequence. Also importantly, that standing up on 2 feet frees the hands to do things such as carve bone flutes. And over time, walking knits together muscular exertion, motion, and sound, or the auditory and the motor cortex in the brain. And one of the profoundest consequences of that is that when we talk about music moving, music moves, it travels, we talk of music as a journey, we dance to music as if it moves. We're not talking metaphorically, it really does move. And bipedalism stamps the experience of human music, every measure, every bar of its life ever since. Now, another consequence of standing up is that the larynx, the voice box, gradually descends. It's quite high up in the throat of an ape, and it gradually descends down as we evolve. And we evolve a hyoid bone, which connects our tongue to our palate, increasing articulation. And that means that it leads to an explosion in the range of sounds that we can make. In fact, we have more sounds than we need for function. And because we have too many sounds, we can start to play with sounds aesthetically. And this is partly where music comes from. We call this a release from function. This explosion of sound releases them from a need to do anything. And the classic example is a small little monkey called the vervet monkey. And it's famous because it has 4 very distinct threat alarm calls, depending on which creature it sees. So it has alarm calls for an eagle, a leopard, a baboon, and a snake. And they sound quite different to each other. This is an eagle alarm call. And this is a leopard alarm call. And although the vervet has 4 distinct sounds, in no respect do they constitute either a language or a music for 2 very good reasons. They lack any structure. They lack that hierarchical structure we noted in birds and in humpback whales. They're holistic. You can't subdivide them. There are no patterns. And they never, chain the 4 signals together to constitute a sentence. And secondly, they remain as functional signals. They aren't played with, which means that humans are different because the sounds that we make are structured into wholes and parts. And we have so many sounds, we can start to play with sounds aesthetically. Now, let's move on to tools, the history of tool manufacture or tool facture. Lots of archaeologists surmise, they think that Neanderthals had a language. We can recover the FOXP2 gene, which we associate with language. There's a degraded variant of that gene, which we assume is a degraded kind of language. Maybe it's a musical vocalization. And we can assume that the Neanderthal brain was capable of what's called compositionality, an ability to think in terms of parts and wholes. So language has parts and wholes, as does musical grammar. And given that the earliest hafted spear was discovered 400,000 years ago, again in Germany, and we can attribute that to Neanderthals, hafting means putting a flint on a stick. So you have two things, a flint and a stick together, they amount to more than the sum of their parts. They are hierarchical, or they have compositionality. So we can infer that if a Neanderthal brain is capable of compositionality in tool manufacture, they can then map the same faculty onto anything else, language and also music. An example of a musical spear is a scale, because it has parts, it has notes. And the scale or the melody is bigger than the sum of its notes. And similarly, if we go slightly upstream 2 million years ago to Homo erectus, the Acheulean biface, it's a symmetrical two-headed flint. The capacity to nap or to carve symmetry was very distinctive. It displays intelligence, which a female would have found sexy. It's an example of visual beauty, as visual as the peacock's tail or the bowerbird's blue nest. Now, again, if we're talking about the transferability of a faculty from one domain to another, from the visual to the sonic, an example of symmetry in sound is meter or rhythm. So transferring repetition of beats from walking to playing. Again, there's no evidence for that, but we can infer from the evolution of brain that if you're capable of symmetry in one dimension, vision, you can transfer that into the dimension of sound. Now we're back to tools where we started. And let's think about why sapiens could make tools, but Neanderthals couldn't. And again, in terms of the evolution of brain, the argument is that the Neanderthal brain was too encapsulated. So you had a domain responsible for technology and a domain which was responsible for song, but these two domains didn't talk to each other. They were encapsulated. Whereas what distinguishes Homo sapiens is playfulness, an ability to blend and to create connections between different parts of our brain. So basically what a flute is, it's a tool for singing. To imagine a tool for singing entails an incredible quantum leap of brain power, which we take for granted. But it was beyond the reach of Neanderthals throughout their long, long evolution. And this playfulness carries on, defining human music even today. So when Lin-Manuel Miranda imagines a hip-hop musical, he's blending hip-hop with a musical. And when Beethoven imagines a choral symphony in the Ninth Symphony, he blends together a choir with a symphony, never done before. And this playfulness, this mixing continues in the ever-accelerating subdivision of subgenres in all walks of music today. So that's the second slice. Now the third slice in the time remaining, which is the global history and the various musical civilizations, starting where Homo sapiens begin to diffuse out of Africa, through Europe and Central Asia, down to Australasia, then up to Russia, across the Bering Straits, into Alaska and Canada, and then through Mexico's bottleneck and ending up in South America. And what you can do is map the evolving social structures with a kind of music and musical instrument that was capable at that time. So hunter-gatherers, if you're always moving, you need to take portable instruments, lithic, made of stone, or very light bone flutes. You don't take grand pianos with you. If you're a sedentist farmer in the Neolithic period, about 12,000 years ago in the Near East, in Anatolia, then farming has a lot of benefits. You can extract string from the gut of sheep and cows and horses, and you can take the skin of an animal and create a drum. a wooden framed skin drum. And we assume drums are the oldest instruments. They're actually relatively modern in human evolution. And with the Bronze Age and the coming of towns and cities and the invention of metal, you can start to create gongs and bells which are too heavy to carry, but also paradoxically very delicate instruments such as lyres and harps, which are too delicate to carry beyond home. How do we know that? Well, again, through inferential mapping of existing present-day examples of hunter-gatherer societies. If you take, or if you consider these four very, very distinct hunter-gatherer peoples today, the Pygmies of Africa, the Walpiri of Australia, the Inuit of Europe, the Choctaw of America, they are defined by quite different climates, rainforests and deserts and the tundra of the Arctic and the savannas. But there's a commonality, there's a common core. So all of them tend to only use percussion instruments. They don't use string or metal instruments. All of them are highly involved with landscapes and animals. And they're shamanistic societies, invested in spirit travel. And the fact that they share all that bespeaks the possibility of a survival of an ancient core of hunter-gatherer music. Now, what will happen next is a series of snapshots or landmarks, getting faster and faster as we approach the modern day. This is an artist's impression of Çatalhöyük, which is the world's oldest town, 9,000 years ago, again in Anatolia. It's a human beehive of lots of boxes piled on top of each other, suggesting a standardization of house design. And in every single box or house, you can find frescoes above the hearth or the altar, and these frescoes suggest that there was an orchestra going on. What you see there is people banging drums, but also stroking hunting bows, which are the ancestor of the modern violin. It's a kind of violin and percussion orchestra. But importantly, it's happening inside. It's a domestication of music happening within the home. Now, the world's first composer was a woman, which is, I think, extraordinary, given that there are no women in the Western canon of composers from Monteverdi through to Schoenberg. And her name was Enheduanna. She was a Sumerian princess and the daughter of King Sargon the Great. And she sang songs of the moon goddess on top of what was probably the Tower of Babel, or the ziggurat of Ur. And she was incredibly important because she represents a fountainhead of both the Homeric hymns and the Jewish psalms. She's at the center, the font and origo, really, of human music. And you can see her portrayed in this medallion, flanked on either side by Enheduanna's scribe and her hairdresser. Was there a common musical language, a lingua franca, analogous to Sanskrit, Sanskrit being the origin of Indo-European languages? Well, we believe there was. And Flavius Josephus, the Roman historian, alleges that Egyptian harps were tuned to the organon, trigonon, enharmonion, or the enharmonic genus, which is roughly made of alternating major thirds and minor seconds. And the famous comparative anthropologist Kurt Sachs calls this the Pan-Asian major third trichord belt. And importantly, every scale between Egypt and Japan, including Indonesia, has evidence of this enharmonic scale pattern, with two incredibly significant exceptions, namely ancient Rome and China. Why? What they have in common is that Rome and China were two imperial bureaucracies, and bureaucracies like standardization. And what they both do in different ways is plug the holes in the enharmonic system into whole tone or whole note scales. Pentatonic or 5-note scales in China, and diatonic or 7-note scales in Rome. And there are lovely examples of Cicero the Roman orator, making fun of the complexity, the enharmonic complexity of the music of the ancient Greek plays. And the Roman Empire was a simplification of Greek music. It was an empire of pop, as it were. And here we are with the Silk Road, and which sends silk from China to Western Europe and brings back horses back to China. It didn't just convey silk, it also conveyed musical instruments. And everywhere they went, they changed their name. So the lute went to Greece and became a pandura, went to India, became a vina, China, a pipa, Japan, a biwa, Persia, a barbat, and the Arabic oud, and the violin begins as the Mongolian kyorchi, the Chinese huqin, the Arab rebab, the Spanish Andalusian viele, and the European rebec. I think the central role of the story belongs to music notation, and the earliest examples of that are the Sumerians and the Babylonians, who invent writing, but also writing music, not just writing. And this famous exhibit is the oldest known piece of music notation. It's the Hurrian hymn number 6 from Ugarit. It's dated 1400 BC. It's cuneiform, chiseled into a clay tablet. We're much more familiar with this example of staff notation. Cuneiform is tablature, it tells you what to play, but staff notation tells you what you hear, the pitches. Guido d'Arezzo was an Italian monk, and he invents modern staff notation. And it becomes a very powerful tool for the church on behalf of church control. Now, the Pope sitting in the Vatican in Italy can now be absolutely assured that anybody singing in the farthest reaches of the church empire or Christendom, say where I used to live, near Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain, they literally sang from the same hymn sheet. They sang the same, and that was incredibly important. And all he had to do was to send out the hymn sheet from Rome to northern Britain to assure that. And before then, you'd have to send soldiers and a monk to teach the locals how to sing. So notation becomes a tool of church organization and church power, and eventually becomes a tool of colonialization. You can colonize the whole planet by sending scores around the world. And so when the Spanish under Cortés invade Mexico and they slaughter the Aztecs, this is an engraving of the festival, the massacre at the festival of Toxcatl. I think it's quite interesting. The first people that the Mexican conquistador, the Spanish conquistadores slaughter are the musicians. The musicians are the first to go. And yet, the record of the conquest is quite interesting. This is the timeline of the colonization of Mexican Aztec music, beginning in 1519 when he lands in Mexico. And within about 10 years, we have an Aztec Indian choir performing Spanish polyphony in Mexico Cathedral. It takes less than, not much more than 1 decade to colonize the music of the Indians. And then, a century later, 1617, the birth of Juan de Lienas, the first indigenous great Indian composer. I say great because you can buy CDs of him. And this is a Vespers composed by de Lienas. And to my ears, this sounds just indistinguishable from any other example of Spanish Renaissance polyphony. So the rate of colonization is incredibly fast and begs the question, who owns this music? In the same way that who owns the English language, who owns Shakespeare, who owns football or cricket, who owns capitalism, who owns high finance? But the journey has been the Western pathway from the symbolic mind, and we saw how the symbolic mind happens with the maturity of behavioral modernity 40,000 years ago, the carving of the first bone flute, and almost an inevitable chain reaction leads to music notation, to colonialism, and to globalization. But of course, there are other paths other than the Western path. And I have no time today to more than touch upon these paths. The South Indian Carnatic path is very distinctive to Western music. On the left, we see M.S. Subbulakshmi, who was Gandhi's favorite singer and arguably the most accomplished Carnatic singer of the 20th century. And on the right, we have a contemporary of Beethoven, a composer called Tyagaraja. And when Tyagaraja composes a song such as Soga Suga, a Carnatic devotional hymn, it's picked up by Subbulakshmi through an oral tradition where a guru teaches a song to their disciple, and they teach the song to their disciple in an unbroken chain of guru-disciple transmission without the necessity of having written notation. And this kind of music doesn't have any harmony, it's quite monophonic, but it makes up for that with a much more developed sense of ornamentation and improvisation. And an equally important pathway is the one trodden by China. It's often said that if the West is a string culture based on the subdivision of the strings of a harp or a lyre, China is a bell or a gong culture, taking its frame of reference from metal. So in 1978, the Red Army uncover a tomb where was buried a Chinese warlord called the Marquis Yi of Zen, and interred with the Marquis was a fabulous collection of 65 bronze bells. And these bells show that China was capable of a chromatic 12 semitone scale 2,000 years before the Italians came up with it. But more importantly, Chinese acoustic science was infinitely more advanced than in the West. And the acoustic richness of the resonance of these bells, which is so arresting, and it bespeaks an interest in timbre, or colour, or acoustics, much more refined in China than in the West, where we typically care much more about pitch and harmony than instrumentation or colour. But you don't have to, this is what it sounds like. But we don't have to stick with metal. The same sensitivity to colour is evinced in the music of the guqin, or the qin, which is a zither or a flat kind of harp. Whenever Confucius was portrayed, they tended to paint him sitting beneath an apricot tree, holding court with his disciples, and playing the guqin. Now, Guqian music was notated, but significantly, they notated the finger positions and the performance technique, but not the pitch or the rhythm. And the acoustic complexity of each note lends itself to blending with environmental sounds, which is why it's often shown being performed in nature, where the sound of the notes would blend beautifully with the wind soughing through the bamboo groves or the sound of rippling water. And that is an incredibly important point, because in the West, we make a distinction, don't we, between the tones of music and the sounds of the environment. The two are very different. And to bring in this important word of bubble, that in the West we are trapped in sonic bubbles of music, and we don't really engage, or very rarely engage, with the sounds of the environment or the ecology, or in short, with nature. And Confucius is much closer to nature than a Western musician would be. So when we talk about the origins of music, it ultimately leads us back to here, to a mother or caregiver's duet with her infant, her baby. And that duet of cooing and laughing and singing and touching and smiling creates a holistic cross-modal song, which is also sociable. It's between two people. And that is the template for how we interact with other musicians in a string quartet or in a jazz collective.
Hi. Is that right? Yeah. Oh. Mm. Yeah. You chewing on your burp cloth? You found your hands. Yummy. Now it's so exciting.
So that, for me, epitomizes the sociability, the intrinsic social quality of human music, which is intrinsically participatory. It's something that we make with other people. And even when we're consuming music in our armchair through earbuds, we're, as it were, plugging ourselves into a social network made up of conventions. We're never really alone when we're consuming music. And yet, the take-home message seems to be, in this long journey from bone flutes or dinosaurs to where we are today, something has been lost. This participatory quality has been lost, that most of us consume music passively as listeners. We don't tend to make music actively as makers or performers. And moreover, we've lost our link with nature. So Confucius had it, because we purify sound into tones, into highly periodic sounding tones, and make that distinction in our sonic bubble between musical tones and natural sounds. But all is not lost, and we learned a lot from lockdown. And what I've learned in lockdown, that in Britain every Thursday evening, a couple of years ago, we would get out of our houses and stand on our doorsteps, all of us, everybody in the street, and we would see each other doing that, and we would clap for the National Health Service. So we're applauding health, we're also self-medicating. And that's a lovely, virtuous feedback loop where self-medicating as a way of curing ourselves and also congratulating our own health workers, and reminding ourselves that music at its source is percussive, and it's sociable, and it is participatory. So I think the future looks interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very interesting. I was wondering, so you showed this picture of the mother and child as an origin of music, and I wonder if it kind of is even earlier than that, when the child is still in the womb and hears the kind of, the mother's heartbeat. And that kind of made me think about the first instruments as well, being the melodic ones, and if it's not likely that there are like rhythmic ones that are even earlier than that, which we still haven't found, maybe. And also linked to that, my question is, so I think in South Africa, they found these singing rocks, which I think are supposedly earlier than like. So I wonder what you think about them, if they kind of predate the flutes as maybe percussive, rhythmic instruments.
Yes. Do you mean the Tanzanian rock gongs?
They might be, yeah.
Yeah, I meant things you make yourself, not what you discover. So people were banging stalactites and rock gongs and what may have you a lot earlier than the flutes. But your first question, and I was thinking about this because when a fetus is in the womb and is surrounded by the gurgling amniotic fluid, she isn't making a distinction between the sound of her mother and environmental sound of nature. It's the same. And of course, when we hear the sea or listen to the sound of the sea in a conch shell today, it reminds us of that amniotic sound of the environment. So it sort of does lead us away from what I was talking about, sociability, to the relationship of a person with nature and with the environment, which is the same in the womb, in utero, but then splits apart when the baby is born. And tests which show that newborn infants respond to the heartbeat of their parent and they smile more. And also, they put on weight a lot faster when they hear that heartbeat or when they hear their mother laughing or singing. So the importance of the parent singing to the child helps the child flourish in their first months. So there's a chapter at the end of the book where I speculate about posthumanism and the difference between posthuman music, or the musical posthuman as I call it, and the musical transhuman. And there's a lot of talk about, will there ever be an AI Mozart, an AI genius composer? And an American computer scientist called David Cope taught a computer an algorithm and called it Emmy or Emily. And famously, it churned out a fake artificial Mozart and Bach and Chopin. And famously, when that was performed to an audience in the Eastman Conservatoire of Music, 50% of the audience couldn't tell the two apart. They couldn't tell fake Chopin apart from the real Chopin. So this is the question. If the book is about what is human about human music, are we ever going to be replaced by AI? And I'm quite pessimistic about that because I think that music is very close to creativity, and creativity is very close to what makes us human. And I think that all the, incredible use of technology today with the internet and computing and social media, it's in the end no more than a tool. It's a tool which enhances us, augments us physically and cognitively, but it doesn't replace us. It extends us. And that's, in a sense, no different to how a violin or a hand axe extends our hand or our arm. It's quite different from replacing us. And the reason I'm doubtful about whether there will ever be a convincing AI composer is because I think that human music is very close to our emotions and our sense of embodiment, having a body, knowing what it is to walk, to stand up, to feel gravity, to feel pain, to be time limited, knowing that we're going to die. All these things are so intrinsic to human music, and I don't think that a non-carbon-based intelligence will ever be capable of emulating that, or if it does, of speaking to us in a way which we would find interesting. But that's just my hunch, and it'd be a very foolish person indeed who would predict the future of anything, including the future of music. But my suspicion is that, I'll stick my neck out here, the future of music. One thing which has been desperately underexplored, and I touched upon that earlier, is environmental sound. And for me, the most interesting, most recent developments are composers such as Chris Watson, who's a field recordist, who collaborates with composers. So to create sound installations, stroke compositions, which do pierce that bubble, that sonic bubble, to go out there and to engage with nature, with the environment. And the reason we haven't done that is a story of the West. It's a story of why we've cocooned ourselves in sonic homes or sonic bubbles as a way of protecting ourselves from the sounds of the environment, actually. And no one quite knows how and why people are inspired by the sounds of trees or water, rivers and seas, or the sound of wind. We take it for granted that we're inspired by natural sounds, but it's very hard to prove how you get from one to the other, how you get from, you know, the sound of trees and birds to a composer who's supposedly inspired by that, or inspired by a mountain range or by a desert. So I suspect there's a huge new continent of music waiting to be discovered in the future when we go outside our sonic bubble.
So in the last passage, you've mentioned sound of trees, sound of wind. What was the verb? You've said why people are inspired by these sounds?
Yes.
Okay. Because most of natural noises are like technically white noises, meaning that they spread evenly through all the musical spectrum, frequency spectrum. Yes, there are, for example, waterfalls which are more sub-bass rich, and this makes it pink noise, but whatever. A lot of scientists were studying this effect, and it actually affects our parasympathetic nervous system. This part of nervous system is responsible for like relaxation, recovery, and all those processes. And white noise is, I can't name you the study, but it's like 90% sure that it's proved to like basically make us relaxed, make us recover. And that's one of the reasons why in these baby radios there are devices that play just white noise for babies to fall asleep quicker. So, and Chinese music is very chill out, I would say. Maybe they were grandparents of ambient.
Thank you. And yet the puzzle is Beethoven. And we know Beethoven loved nature. He walked in nature all the time, but he was deaf. He couldn't hear any of the white or the pink noise. And so we underestimate how cross-modal, so it's visual and tactile and kind of aesthetic. So the experience of walking through nature and the acoustic affordances, as Gibson would say, the affordances of the terrain, the landscape. Is it steep to climb, climbing a mountain or going down a hill or going through a forest and not having any light? It's a very complex cross-modal experience. You don't actually have to hear anything to be inspired by nature.
I know a little about Beethoven's source of inspiration, but knowing that he was sort of born deaf, I assume that he's approaching music.
He wasn't born deaf.
He wasn't born deaf. Ah, okay. That's the answer. So I was thinking that he was approaching music from like mathematical and schematic, you know, like there is ratios of frequencies, stuff like that. He was basically like programming music without need to hear it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So you started your talk with the Voyager and the golden record, and then you mentioned that you think it's unlikely that AI will ever like replace. Will be able to replace an artist, and we'll be able to create music in the same way humans done, because music is intrinsically human.
Yes.
Do you think it was a bit too optimistic and misguided to send the record? Like, will an alien will be able to understand human music and vice versa?
Yeah, it's a very questionable thing to do, unless they can also simultaneously reconstruct a human and to show how the human mediates the sound. But I'm not sure Voyager carried any genetic material. Did they? I don't know. Well, yes, you're right. I think that we're locked into the way we are. We can't get too far away. I think our emotions are ancient. And Charles Darwin's book, The Expression of Emotions in Man, Animals and Man, persuasively argues that emotions are adaptive, and we share similar adaptive responses to dogs and monkeys, how we use emotions to get through the environment. So emotions don't go away, and we have this funny brain where we have this neocortex, which is very modern, and it processes pattern. But we have the amygdala, which is, or the reptile brain, which is ancient and responds to shocks and to brutal pleasure and to emotions. And we have, so listening to music, we deep dive through time. So, or even time travel. So parts of ourselves resonates to the pattern in the music, but also we vibrate to the ancient emotions of this music. And that makes music very special compared to the other art forms. I don't think literature or painting can time travel in that way. So I call it, in my book, music is our umbilical cord back to Mother Nature. Thank you.